Mochi Health is here to help you start your weight loss journey with caring, personalized support. Meet one-on-one with board-certified obesity doctors and registered dietitians who truly listen and understand your unique needs. Eligible patients can access affordable GLP-1 medications delivered right to their door each month. No insurance? No problem. Mochi Health accepts FSA and HSA, making care accessible and affordable. And with 24/7 customer service, you'll never feel alone on your path to better health. Get started with Mochi Health today. Take the free quiz at joinmochi.com and use code AUDIO40 at checkout for $40 off your first month of membership. That's joinmochi.com with promo code AUDIO40.
Hello, everybody. This is Brett.
And this is Alice.
And Alice, as you know, I am obsessed with disappearances. And it's probably a surprise to nobody that I am also obsessed with the television show Disappeared. So when I found out that Patrick Hines and Ellen Marsh were doing a new show going through every one of the episodes of ID's Disappeared, I was all over it.
I can vouch for that. You definitely are obsessed with Disappeared. And we're excited about this new podcast because Obsessed with Disappeared is a true crime comedy podcast that tells the mysterious story of a missing person by recapping the episode of the ID show Disappeared that covered their case.
And while Obsessed with Disappeared is light and funny, it never finds humor at the expense of the victim or the crime, which is something we can appreciate here at The Prosecutors.
Obsessed with Disappeared is an easy listen. It's hilarious and informative storytelling from two best friends who truly love each other and will do just about anything to make the other one laugh.
So if you're fascinated by cases of missing people and you're serious about true crime, but also love to laugh, you'll love Obsessed with Disappeared. Find Obsessed with Disappeared wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are The Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we do our best to solve an age-old mystery. Who committed the murders at Hinterkaifeck? Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, with my esoteric co-host, Alice.
Is that supposed to be a compliment?
I think it is. I like esoteric.
Yeah,
it means you're
maybe
like
if I were a
mysterious
professor,
and hidden.
or like if I were a professor. Thanks for thinking I'm a serious person.
Exactly. Sometimes difficult to understand, sometimes confusing and complex, and only really aimed at weird people. But
so my point exactly is that a compliment?
It's a compliment in my view.
Okay. If you think it's a compliment.
I was going to call you like cyclopean, which is a great word from Lovecraft, but it means like huge. So I thought that would probably be an insult if I called you that. So I decided to go with esoteric instead. Could have called you Eldritch, my Eldritch co-host, Alice.
Oh my gosh, the people who hate us already hate us more now.
I know. My goal is to drive those people away. I want them never to listen to us again. So
is it like the first?
That's my objective in these little intros.
Is it like the first day of law school where certain professors have that tactic where they come in and they're like raging mad and they're like, "I'm gonna fail all of you," and then half the class drops out, and then when they come back the next time, they're the most lovely person. They're like, "That's my tactic to make this a small class size."
Exactly. So that we can, because we want loyal, dedicated fans. We don't want these like fellow traveler, warm weather for fans. We don't want that. We want the real fans we've got. Fans like Garl Gar Laser Eyes. Gar Laser Eyes. That's their name. Which this is a 5-star review we got on Apple, and I have to read it because this person is brilliant, and I want to share their brilliance with the world. Here's what they say. Dunkin' Donuts are trash. Current Bostonian here. I'm just saying they're an expert. I 100% agree that Dunkin' Donuts are trash. This podcast, however, is absolutely fantastic. Do yourself a favor and get a delicious Krispy Kreme donut and listen to Brett and Alice review cases from the point of view of a prosecutor. I have been binging all week. Thank you, Gar Laser Eyes. You are a genius, sir, and we're happy to have you amongst our fan base.
So, Gar Laser Eyes, you are awesome, except for the Dunkin' Donuts comment, but I will overlook that only because I think perhaps you led with Dunkin' Donuts because you're a closet Dunkin' Donut lover, and I say this because recently, after my comment about how Dunkin' Donuts is far superior to the free Krispy Kreme donuts that I get, I had a friend of, the husband of a friend, so I don't know this person very well, but I love his wife. He texted me some trash talk about Dunkin' Donuts, trash talking me all night long about Dunkin' Donuts and how terrible it is. Then, what do I see on social media? Nary a week later, a Dunkin' Donuts in hand as he's enjoying his New England fall vacation. So, I'm not going to call this person out by name, but I don't think Dunkin' Donuts is trash.
He's like a closeted Dunkin' Donuts fan. He can't admit it to himself. He doesn't want to admit that he likes trashy donuts.
It's okay,
which
everyone.
I can understand, I just want to say that if Krispy Kreme weren't giving all these donuts away, they could sponsor our podcast. But whatever. If Dunkin' Donuts wants to throw some money this way, I'll start liking Dunkin' Donuts. That's my position on Dunkin' Donuts.
So back to axe murders. There was no easy way to segue from donuts to murders.
Hey, it's the Halloween season, and both Krispy Kreme and Dunkin' Donuts have some wonderful holiday-themed, probably axe murder-ish donuts. So with that in mind, let's go back to Hinterkaifeck. I assume they like donuts in Germany. I'm sure they had some before this murder happened. So that's your connection. Alice, we've covered the story, I think, but I think it's time to go through the timeline if you want to take us away.
Absolutely. Let's go to the timeline. Keep in mind these dates, it happens all pretty quickly. So it starts back in 1914. Victoria marries Carl Gabriel, and she has a child, Cazilia. Carl then goes to fight in the war and is killed. In May 1915, a servant walks in on Victoria and Andreas having sex. Both are arrested and sentenced to jail, Andreas longer than Victoria. Several years later, in 1918, Lorenz proposes marriage to Victoria. Victoria becomes pregnant, but it's likely by Andreas.
We say it's likely by Andreas, and I assume it probably is, but I don't know if there's any way to confirm that. You know what I mean? People always say it's likely Andreas, but I just don't know.
That's very fair, and we're all about, the evidence here. So technically, by the books, Lorenz is the father, right? Remember that whole settlement that he agreed to? He paid, he didn't contest fatherhood, and he paid the child support, but then was actually paid back by Andreas. And I think that's kind of why the speculation is that Lorenz is not the father, because why would you pay back child support kind of off the books if there was no reason to do so?
And we mentioned it yesterday, and I just want to say it again. I am convinced that he did that because Victoria asked him to.
Yeah, I mean, he did propose marriage to her, and there was no, social status or money reason to marry Victoria. He had the social status and he had the money. So it seems that he proposed to Victoria because he loved her. And if she asked something like that, I can imagine he would say, fine, I'll kind of do this one last thing for you as we part ways. Because though he proposes, as we said yesterday, they do not get married. And in July 1919, Joseph is born. Now, March 25th, 1922. Remember, those passerbyers see Victoria in the woods and she's hysterical, but they don't know why. On March 30th, Andreas finds a newspaper that's printed in Munich that he's never subscribed to, and it's not his newspaper. He also notices his shed has been broken into, and there is at least one set of footprints leading from the forest to the farm and no footprints leading back to the forest. And that night, the family hears noises, probably footsteps, in the attic above them. The next day, on March 31st, Andreas goes to the attic and checks, but he finds nothing except for the hay that was strewn across the floor. On April 1st, Kazilia does not show up to work and no one is seen at the farm during the day, though at night, there is a man around the farm and the animals are quiet, indicating that they've been taken care of. The next day, April 2nd, the family doesn't show up to church, out of character for them. April 3rd, the mailman comes by and he notices that their kitchen door's ajar, and he's surprised not to see Joseph, since the boys always watched him deliver the mail through the window.
That's a very child thing to do, you know, when the mailman comes by, probably excited to see him, watch him deliver the mail.
Yeah, I mean, this is, 100 years later, but my son loves watching the mailman deliver. Actually, we have a mail lady deliver the mail so much and waves to her every single day that one day, this is another wonderful, heartwarming COVID story. The mail lady actually left him a little metal figurine of a mail truck inside our mailbox for him and wrote him a note that said, "For the little boy who loves the mail truck." How sweet is that?
It's so sweet. That's so sweet. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, these are the kind of stories that make you happy.
So that we have the world's best mail lady, and she really does seem to work around the clock. But all that to say is I can absolutely imagine that the mailman would notice that this boy didn't see him deliver. Our mail lady certainly noticed that my boy watched her deliver mail every single day. And so that particular fact just really tugs at my heart. That's not the only person that notices something is off with the house. On April 4th, the repairman arrives and he reports the strange situation at the farm. And the situation is that there's no one there. He's shown up to fix something and he starts working and he's there for hours, but he sees no one. And remember, he sees the dog tied up barking. So he reports this to Lorenz's family. And later on that day, the bodies of the family are found. Now, on April 5th, everyone known to the police is interrogated, but no arrests are made.
Yeah, and I think, this is a long time ago. It's 100 years ago, and it's kind of funny to think about, the police back then and what they're working with. A lot less technology and everything else than we have. But one thing they seem to have done is they talked to everybody who was near that farm that day. So, and we do have some of those reports, and we've read some of those to you yesterday. We're going to read more of them to you as we go on. Right.
It's really interesting to look back on kind of the firsthand accounts and interviews and how actually similar our, witness questioning is 100 years later, because there really is, a storytelling that you get to draw from people and put their stories together and see what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Moving along with our timeline, we're almost done. February of 1923. Remember, the farm has been empty since the family was murdered, but it's now torn down. And during that process, the murder weapon is finally discovered, hidden inside the house. Hidden in the attic, actually. And on April 5th, 1925, a local teacher, Hans Blager, runs into Lorenz Schlittenbauer at the ruins of the farm.
And remember, this is basically 3 years after this happened. I mean, almost to the day.
This is your before and after story. Instead of imagining a rewarding career in medical imaging, Southeastern College can actually take you there. Prepare for a career in ultrasound, radiology, and X-ray technology with hands-on specialized training, simulations, and real-life experience with the latest imaging technology. You'll be ready to play a vital role on any healthcare team. Transform your life by helping others. Southeastern College. Your future is bright. Visit scc.edu to get started.
If you're looking to streamline your audio advertising buys and maximize your revenue, look no further than Triton Digital's programmatic audio advertising exchange, A2X. The private exchange consists of only licensed broadcasters and top-tier internet radio publishers, assuring the quality inventory and brand safety you can trust. Visit www.tritondigital.com to learn more.
Right. And the reason this is notable to Hans is that Lorenz is bent over the remains of the cellar stairs and he's staring down into the cellar. And Lorenz is out of sorts and appears shocked when Hans spoke to him. Lorenz muttered something about how an attempt was made to dig 1 or 2 holes near the places where the corpses were found, perhaps to bury the corpses in them, but the ground was still too hard from freezing to dig the holes. This is just a strange encounter, and from this point forward, Hans believes that Lorenz is the one who killed the family.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're going to talk a lot about Lorenz today when we talk about suspects. This is a very unusual thing. I mean, we really only have Hans's word for this, but it's one of those things where you can imagine if you had done this terrible thing. I mean, there's no indication, for instance, that if Lorenz did this, he's a serial killer, right? So he's not the kind of person whose conscience is so seared that this wouldn't bother him. It would probably be something that would stick with him for the rest of his life. And so you sort of imagine this scenario where the guilty man returns to the site of the murder 3 years later. Maybe he goes back every year type thing. And he's in this sort of weird state and he's sort of muttering to himself. And he says this thing to Hans that's very incriminating. If he actually said that, that's very incriminating because that seems like something only the murderer would know.
Yeah, and the strange thing about this is, sure, consciousness can haunt you and they can grow over time and really overtake your mental state. But this is many years later, and it's not clear what would make him kind of have this spell where he feels immense guilt and is bent over. It is an anniversary, but it's several years later. Maybe. I have some thoughts about how this crime likely was committed by someone who knew the family, and Lorenz certainly knew the family. In March 1931, Lorenz is interrogated in Munich once again. In this interrogation, Lorenz contradicts previous statements, raising police suspicions, but there's just not enough evidence to act against him. And 10 years later, in 1941, Lorenz dies. And this is still an unsolved mystery.
And I wish we knew what statements Lorenz contradicts. You see this a lot, that he did contradict statements and that police said that, but it's unclear what he contradicted. So you wonder, was it really important stuff? Was it sort of minor things? Was it the kind of thing you would expect one might forget after 9 years? Is it the kind of thing you wouldn't? I think some of it goes to how they got from the barn to in the house. There's been a lot of talk about that. Did they have a key? Did they not have a key? Did he find the key? Did he have the key on him? All that stuff. We talked about that some yesterday. But by this point, by 1931, there are certainly people in the police force who suspect Lorenz. And what's interesting, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, is they didn't suspect him as much as maybe you would think in the early days of the investigation. So that's the timeline. Now, from this point forward, we're going to talk about some of the weird stuff we've already touched on in this case. And really, when you think about these things, I mean, this is an old case, right? I mean, this is from 1922. The chances of ever solving this definitively are essentially nil. But if you apply some of our sort of modern thoughts on perpetrators, the kind of people who commit these crimes, the kind of things that happened in this crime, some of the weird things we're going to talk about, maybe you can develop sort of a picture of the kind of person who would commit this crime, and then you can think, are there people who fit that picture? And if they are, like I said, we're never going to know for sure, but you can reach some sort of conclusion about who you think might have done this. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the acrid smell from the fire. You may recall that the night after the murders probably happened, a gentleman was walking past Hinterkaifeck, and he noticed there was smoke coming from the chimney, and there was sort of a person in the yard who bothered him. I think they shined a light in his eyes, and he sort of hurried on because it was just weird to him. He didn't like the feel of it. And he said that the smoke from the fire had a strange sort of acrid smell to it. And you sort of wonder, what could they have been burning? Here's what we know for sure. It wasn't the bodies. They find the bodies, they're not burned. There's nothing missing from the house that could account for that, right? Like if you think about what could they possibly be burning, there just doesn't seem to be anything. And I think the thing that makes the most sense, particularly if you tie it into some of the other stuff that's happening here, is that the person is burning clothes, probably blood-stained clothes. Now, if that's true, and once again, that's speculation, that sort of tells you something. If he's burning clothes, if he's burning things that he owns that might identify him, that makes you think this is someone who is from the area for a couple reasons. Number one, because if they're burning their clothes, they have to have some source of other clothes, and there's no indication that they stole any clothes from the farm. Number two, if they're burning the clothes, that's a risk, right? And we're going to talk about this a lot. A lot of sort of modern research on killers. If someone attempts to cover up the crime, it is more likely that they are local because they need to buy time to get away from the scene. They're not going to be able to get all the way away because they live there, right? Or whatever. They need to buy time to get away from the scene, sort of reinsert themselves into life, and be able to point to all sorts of different things they were doing, their alibis, while they weren't there, while they could have done it, all that sort of stuff. But in hiding the bodies, or in hiding the clothes, or in hiding the murder weapons, you're taking a chance because you're spending more time around the scene of the crime. You're opening yourself up to someone showing up and seeing you there doing those things. Usually, people who are transients, who are just passing through, who murder someone and then move on, they just leave the body there. They just leave the murder weapon there because no one can tie them to the scene. No one can tie them to the area, and it's more important for them just to get away. If they can get away from where the body is and then hop a train or catch a ride or whatever and be out of town, the chances of them ever being found are slim. So the fact that this person is burning the clothes makes you think that they are someone who is from the area who needs to get rid of any possible evidence, particularly evidence of blood being on clothes that someone would recognize.
And Brett, one thing that is, we don't know a lot, but we know that the person who is standing there burning things wasn't naked, right? Probably right. Because that would be a very notable fact, and someone would have reported the fact that a naked man was standing there burning clothes. Rather, that man was clothed, and based on kind of the gory nature of this murder of multiple people, it would be almost impossible for blood not to have gotten on the killer. I would say it's impossible for him to have struck these individuals with that axe, with blunt force, and blood not to have gotten on him. And probably a lot of blood because there were so many people that he murdered that it probably would have been noticeable on him. And again, it may have been dark. The man who passed by and saw this individual burning something, he didn't stop for long, but he did not notice things like the fact that the person was not wearing clothes, because he probably was wearing clothes, and second, that it wasn't blood stained, meaning probably burned some clothes.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's no way he committed this crime and didn't get blood all over him, or at least a good amount of blood. And as we talk about more of the crimes and how some of these people were killed, some of this was pretty intimate. It wasn't just, swinging the mattock and smashing someone's skull in, which in of itself is probably going to get blood all over you. So yeah, I think there's no question. He had blood on his clothes. Nobody ever found any bloody clothes. The obvious thing is he was burning those clothes in the fire that night.
And here's a question, I guess. Why burn the clothes? So burning something definitely draws attention to you. Why burn it near the scene of the crime and not, say, in the woods? Of course, people may go investigate what's burning in the woods, but maybe by that point you could have gotten away. So my thought is he may have been burning clothes, but he may have been burning like something else that had blood on it. I know nothing as significant was burning from the house, but I think something around there needed to be disposed of, which is why he chose to take the risk of being seen of burning things at the house.
And I would be interested to know if anybody out there has any thoughts on why the fire was particularly acrid. I think there's probably somebody out there who can come up with a pretty good theory about what you would be burning that would cause that kind of acrid smell.
Yeah, that I don't know. My only thought was it's a farm, maybe some animal that has died. I don't know why it would have died and why he'd be burning the animal, but it feels like it needs to be something that was once living, and like you said, the bodies, the victims were not burned.
Right.
Wow. So another unusual aspect is that the animals, as we've mentioned, were fed and taken care of. Now, what is the purpose of this? If the animals had been noisy and unfed, and they'd certainly be unnoisy if they hadn't been taken care of, if they were hungry, it would have raised suspicions pretty soon. Because if you've ever been around farm animals, they are fed regularly and obviously daily. So they'll get loud pretty quickly if they are unfed. So it appears that the person who committed this crime needed time to cover it up, just like Brett mentioned. And they also knew that there were animals to be taken care of and which animals to be taken care of, because all the animals, remember, were quiet when passerbyers came. Now, this again indicates that the murderer was not a stranger to this farm and to this family, because it was someone who knew that the police might be looking at them eventually, and they needed to buy time. The longer that the police did not come to investigate, the better chance they had of either destroying evidence, hiding evidence, or getting away and reinserting themselves into the local life there.
Yeah, it's impossible for me to believe that sort of a wandering highwayman showed up at this house with the intention of robbing it and hung around and fed the animals. You know, it's crazy to think they would do that. They would want to get away as soon as possible. This person, for whatever reason, whether you think it was because they were covering things up or because of a psychological block. You know, we talked about this, and that two-star person's not going to like this. We talked about this back in Michael Peterson, where Michael Peterson, you might think that the reason, if you believe that the blood was dry and you think that Kathleen had been dead for a while, and it took a while for Michael Peterson to call the police, part of that might be that he was cleaning up, but part of it was also just a psychological block that he knew once you call 911, it all starts, right? That's the beginning of this. The sort of murder ends and the investigation begins, and you want to kind of put that off for as long as possible. And I think that's possible what's happening here, that just whoever did this knew that as soon as the police figured it out, as soon as people really noticed that the family was missing, that was when it was all going to start. That was when the investigation was going to start and when their life would really change forever. And you know, they can't do anything about the fact that the family's not going to church or school, but what they can do is sort of delay suspicion by doing things like feeding the animals and presumably also milking the cows, like all the sort of things that you have to do on a family every day. And another thing about this, I realize it's 1922 and I realize, you know, people had skills. You know, I have no skills. I can't do anything really, but back then people could, but nevertheless, this is somebody who knew how to do these things, right? They knew how to feed the animals. They knew how to milk the cows. I mean, these aren't things that maybe the guy who showed up to fix the diesel engine 3 days later, he may not know how to do that because maybe he never lived on a farm, or maybe it's been so long that he wouldn't really know how to take care of these animals. This person did. They were confident in that kind of thing. And so they were someone who could do this. And I think, as Alice said, it just makes me think it's somebody that lives around there, who's also a farmer, who knows how to take care of animals.
Right. You know, this is funny. I don't live on a farm, but I actually had a conversation with someone today about how they were keeping a few animals. And the comment he made to me was, yeah, it's great having, you know, chickens for fresh eggs, but whenever you go on vacation, you have to think about who's going to take care of your animals because you can't just leave them. It's like having a dog. You can't just leave your dog, you know, when you go on vacation because they need to be fed. And so, again, this is something that is on anyone's mind who has animals.
And it worked, right? Because there were people who stopped by that farm in the days after the murder who thought it was unusual that they didn't see anybody, but the animals weren't making noise. They all appeared to be taken care of. And so I think for a lot of those people, they thought, well, that's weird. I don't see anybody, but obviously they're here somewhere. The animals are taken care of. If on that Saturday, the coffee guys had showed up and nobody's on the farm and the animals are raising holy hell because nobody's fed them, they may take it more seriously and do something other than just mention it at Lorenz's house down the road. They might actually go to the police. They might report, this is really weird. There's nobody there. The animals are going crazy. But you don't have that. And so it does buy this person a few days.
And Brett, what you just said sparked something in my mind. You said they may have gone to the police and not just mentioned it to Lorenz. Notice throughout this story, the people who have questions keep stopping by Lorenz's house to kind of just raise suspicions and mention it to Lorenz, not the police. This is really interesting. The reason they do this is because they assume Lorenz, whose farm backs up to the back of the Gruber's farm, knows them best or may know their whereabouts, which really goes to the fact that Lorenz knows the family well, and everyone knows that Lorenz knows the family well. And we've kind of mentioned how it seems that this crime needed to be committed by someone who knew the family well.
I think that's exactly right. And I think also what's interesting about that, Lorenz did know the family well. He was the next door neighbor. And this was a time when neighbors took care of neighbors, right? So these guys, the coffee guy and the repairman and all these people, they fully believed. It's basically like going to the police, right? If I stop by the neighbor's house and say, hey, there's something weird going on at your neighbor's house, that's going to be taken care of. Now, Lorenz is never there when they do this. And you got to wonder, is his wife just like the worst wife ever and never delivers any of the messages that come to him? You would think she would. You would think she would find this interesting as well. But the other thing, Lorenz knows that weird stuff was going on at the farm. If we believe what he tells us, we know that Andreas told him that. And in fact, he was so concerned about what Andreas told him that he offered him a gun, which Andreas didn't take. So if your next door neighbor tells you, hey, there's some really weird stuff going on at my farm, I'm really kind of worried about it, and you're so concerned you offer him a gun, and then the next day it seems like they vanished off the face of the earth, one at some point, and you don't see him anymore, like it was like he was running into Andreas all the time up to this when this happened, and they were talking about everything that was going on at the farm, and all of a sudden, Andreas vanishes from the face of the earth. You would think that Lorenz might look into that sometime before, 4 days later or whatever, when he finally sends his kids over there.
Yeah, that was really profound for me when we go through the timeline. I didn't realize that the next day is when he talks to, Gruber talks to Lorenz, sorry. Andreas talks to Lorenz, and it's the very next day that Kazilia doesn't show up to work. So likely that was the night it happened.
Exactly. Yeah, it was, he's told Lorenz about the lock being broken and the keys going missing and the weird newspaper. Then he tells Lorenz, hey, last night, even weirder, I was hearing footsteps in my attic. And Lorenz is like, you might need a gun. He doesn't take the gun. And then it's that night, presumably, that night that they're killed. And then Lorenz doesn't see Gruber anymore. I mean, if it were me, if my next door neighbor right now came over and said, yeah, man, I'm hearing some really weird stuff in my attic, I think there might be people up there. I mean, number one, I would say, hey, you need to call the cops, right? But number two, if the next day the house was locked up tight and silent and my neighbor who was normally wandering around in his yard or on the fence line or whatever doesn't appear, at some point, I'm going over there to see, did the people in the attic murder this guy, right? Like, I would just wonder what's going on. But Lorenz doesn't seem to have that.
And, Lorenz also knew enough that Andreas and the Grubers didn't have a gun, right? He knew that they were essentially unarmed.
He did know that, which is, it's an interesting piece of information to know.
And this is jumping ahead a little bit, but, we now know, usually if you are the person to find a missing body and that person is suspected to have been murdered, the person who finds the body jumps to the top of a suspicious persons list for the police, whether you know that or not. And that's just because it's hard to find bodies, or experience has shown that murderers want to come back. They want to know what's going on. Now, notice here, though, Lorenz doesn't go to find the body. It's his sons that he sends, kids, in fact, a 9-year-old and a 16-year-old, to go check on the farm. Maybe he knew that it would draw suspicion to him if he were the one to find the bodies. Instead, he sends children. Who would suspect children of doing this?
And the other thing is, imagine my neighbor. He's all sorts of weird stuff shown up in his house. He's getting a newspaper from like New York City, and he's never ordered it. He's hearing noises upstairs. When he finally went to the attic, he notices that all his stuff is strewn about, and it looks like somebody's been walking around up there. I offer him a gun because I'm that concerned about his life. And then he disappears, and the house is silent, and nothing moves there, and there's no one there. You know, my daughter's only 1, but imagine that she were 8. I wouldn't say, hey, honey, can you go check on the neighbor? Just make sure they're okay. I wouldn't do that because I would be worried that if something was wrong with them, I'm sending my daughter over there to potentially stumble upon it. I would do it myself. And the only way you would send your kids, I think, is if you're pretty sure that whatever danger was there before is not there now. I mean, I'm just saying. I realize, like I said, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but I don't think you send your children to a place that you're worried there might be some kind of danger unless you're pretty sure that whatever happened is over and they don't have to worry about, actually running into an axe murderer.
That's a good point. I thought you were going to go the other route and say to defend Lorenz, that if you thought they were going to find murdered people, you wouldn't send your children over there.
Well, I mean, there's that aspect. You could say, look, he wouldn't want his kids to see this kind of thing. But I think there are two things about it. Number one, I think you're right. Them finding the bodies separates him from the murderer, and that's a good thing for him. Number two, he doesn't have to worry about anything happening to them because he knows there's no danger there anymore, if you're assuming he's the person who did it.
Yeah, no, I find that very compelling.
Before we get into that, so we've given you two pieces of evidence that seem to indicate this is a person who is nearby, but there's something else that was going on that maybe makes you think it's not someone who was nearby. And we want to give you everything, which you have a full picture. And that's the fact that there was food cooked in the house, presumably after the murder happened. So apparently whoever was there ate food from the home while there were dead people in the barn and in the bedrooms and everywhere else. And that would seem to indicate this was someone who was a stranger, maybe, who just hung out at the farm for a few days before moving on. You could imagine sort of a transient who doesn't have anything. Maybe, if you want to paint the best picture, they're starving to death and they feel like the only way I can do this, I have to kill these people and then I can eat. This person stays at the house, they eat some food. It's not very clear whether they spent the night in the home. If they're a stranger, you have to assume they did, which means that for 3 or 4 days, they're staying there with decomposing bodies all around them. But the fact that someone ate there, I mean, I guess there was a lot of work to do. They did have to take care of the farm, so maybe they just got hungry. I don't know. But for me, the cooking of food is something that is more indicative of someone passing through than someone who, say, lived next door and knew at any time they could just go home and eat.
Unless, though, it seemed that Lorenz was actually out of town several of the times that people stopped by to report that it was suspicious the Grubers weren't around. So if he's pretending to be out of town on business or to get supplies, he can't go home to eat food. Rather, he needs to stay away for 1, 2, 3 days, however many days that would make his alibi.
That's a great point that you make. And if there's somebody out there who is German and reads German and is maybe more familiar with some of the documents in this case, one thing I have never been able to find is, what did he say he was doing during those days? What was his alibi? We know that he was never home when various people came by to report the weird things they saw at the Gruber house. So if anybody knows, that would be very interesting to know, like what his story was for what he was doing those few days when the family was missing.
Yeah, but I do think there was a lot of work to be done. We obviously know that the person probably hung around to burn things, take care of the animals, and that does take time. It takes hours to take care of all the animals, make sure they're fed, pen them in if they need to be brought in, and you get hungry doing it. Was anything stolen? We've already told you that most sources tell you no, but that's not entirely true. While the house was largely untouched, one storage area next to Victoria Gabriel's bed had been searched, and there were several items lying around on her bed, including a notebook, papers, an empty wallet, and a lady's watch. But still, even though her storage area had been searched, no valuables were taken. Also in her room, within reach of the killer, were gold coins worth about 1,800 marks, silver coins worth 327 marks, 2 gold rings with opal stones, and a pair of gold earrings, 2 wedding rings, one silver men's watch, a silver woman's watch, and a fur stole. In other words, money and also a lot of valuables. So it's impossible that the murderer would have missed all these things, but these were not taken. So, was anything stolen? Not necessarily anything of value, which tells you that this murder probably was not motivated by robbery or burglary. But why search Victoria's storage area and not take anything? What was this person looking for? Maybe a notebook? Maybe something with sentimental value rather than monetary value?
Yeah. So this is one of those things. I mean, look, I listen to a lot of true crime, and I've listened to the Hinterkaifeck story a lot of times in a lot of different places. And this is something that, if it's mentioned, is definitely not mentioned prominently. This was on one of those German sites we found in some of the police reports that were translated by our handy Google Translator. And I think all of this is huge. I think, number one, this is the first time where we start to see, and we're going to see some more stuff that indicates this, that Victoria Gabriel is the focus of this killing. That Victoria is, for whatever reason, the person who mattered the most to this killer. Nobody else's stuff was ransacked, just hers. Valuables weren't taken, but you have to wonder. One thing we don't know, and one thing we can't know, is were there things taken from this little area? I mean, there certainly could have been things missing. Now, if it was someone who was robbing the house, they would have taken the marks. They would have taken the gold coins, the silver coins. They probably would have taken the gold rings. They would have taken the kind of things that a robber takes. It's possible somebody took something, but I think if they did, it was probably either some sort of document that mattered to them for some reason, or, more likely, something of sentimental value, something of Victoria's that this person took for whatever reason, whether it's a trophy or whether, this was something that they took to remind them of Victoria when they weren't in sort of a murderous rage or whatever. It really seems like Victoria is the focus of this, whatever happened. Okay, so one thing that's also not clear is how many footprints were visible in the snow. We talked about this earlier, that there were footprints going from the forest to the house. It's very important to know how many footprints there were. Ordinarily, we are told that there was one set of footprints in the snow. However, according to the initial police report, Lorenz told the police that there were two sets of footprints present, and I will read to you from the report. Footprints of two men leading to the property were visible in the fresh snow, but there was supposedly no trace that would have led away from the property. And then in parentheses, it says, information from the sledge maker. That is what the police refer to Lorenz as again and again in these initial reports. The report goes on to state, on Wednesday, March 29th, two boys between the ages of 18 and 20 are said to have been noticed near the forest of the property of the murdered. Two possible suspects there. And then it goes on to say, in the vicinity of the murder site, two men around 40 years old, speaking a foreign dialect, unusually dressed, without overcoats, turned up. And once again, this information comes from Lorenz. If it's true that there were two sets of footprints, obviously that indicates two killers. That kind of throws a wrench in the idea that it's someone local. Also, Lorenz, most likely, is the person who did this. Lorenz has supplied some suspects. There were two boys who were seen in the forest. And then in case that's not enough, there were also two men around 40 years old who conveniently speak a foreign dialect and are unusually dressed, who were also around the area. And I got to tell you, Alice, the last part in particular, every white woman who ever killed her kids always says that they were kidnapped by like a black man, right? That's what the racist white lady says when she's trying to cover up the fact that she murdered her children. You see it again and again and again. And I got to wonder if these two men with the foreign dialect was sort of the 1922 version of that. If you're going to make up two people who might have been the murderers, make them foreigners who speak a funny language.
It's interesting. I didn't realize that those initial suspects were provided from Lorenz. I knew that he was the one who gave the statement about two sets of footprints. Do you know how the story or the investigation ultimately led to the fact that there was only one set of footprints? Were the footprints still there when the police showed up?
They were not. Here's how I understand it, and based on the reports. Based on the report and the way it's written, and it's not entirely clear, and like I said, it's in German and it's translated, so it's even less clear. It seems like Lorenz told them both of these things, that there were two sets of footprints and the two boys and the two men. Seems like he is the source of that, right? However, the police talked to other people in town, and Andreas and Victoria, when they had gone into town for supplies, apparently also told the stories about the sounds in the attic and the footprints in the snow. And it seems like the idea that there was only one set of footprints comes from those reports. That's an interesting contradiction. And it makes you wonder, who's telling the truth here. Now, Lorenz apparently didn't see these footprints, but is also relying on what Andreas told him. So maybe it was confusion. Maybe Andreas thought he said, or Lorenz thought that Andreas said there were two sets of footprints, and in fact, there were just two footprints. Not 100% sure. It's an interesting sort of inconsistency. I wish we had a little bit more from the police.
This comes from the initial police report, meaning it was close in time to the actual murders. And if people, so in other words, people who heard from Andreas and Victoria in town about the one set of footprints remembered just fine when they spoke to the police. Apparently, none of them mistakenly told the police there were two sets of footprints. It was only, I don't know why I can't remember names today.
Lorenz.
It was only Lorenz who talked about the two footprints, and it wasn't like a bunch of time had passed. It was very recent. And notice he doesn't just stop at there were two sets of footprints, because if you don't really remember what happened, why would you further supply two sets of suspects? That's very specific. And it would be an effective way to kind of send the police on a wild goose chase.
Yeah, I mean, he has provided the police with some very attractive suspects. If they want to think it's sort of young hoodlums, well, they got those. If they want to think that it's some foreigners, coming in and stealing our jobs or whatever, they got them too. So they can sort of pick which way they want to go.
And that gives you a huge range of people to look into. Basically, 18 to 40 years old.
Right.
which is a really big range.
It is a really big range, and it's interesting that the police didn't find these people, right? I mean, look, this is 1922 Germany. It's not New York City today, and the chances that there were two guys in their 40s wandering around wearing strange clothes and speaking in a foreign dialect, and nobody in the surrounding towns are like, hey, those guys are weird. I wonder if they're the ones who killed the people over in Hinterkaifeck. Seems a little strange, right? I mean, it's not like they could jump in their car and drive across country. They would have been in the area, but to my knowledge, nobody else ever saw these people.
Right. And especially the foreign dialect speakers, they would have drawn attention to themselves. Now, the autopsies themselves have been lost, but we do have notes of the prosecutor about these autopsies. What we know is that the injuries to Victoria Gabriel were particularly serious because Prosecutor Renner only highlighted her injuries in particular by stating that the district magistrate had found 9 star-shaped wounds on the young woman's head and choking marks on her neck. The serious injuries, the multitude of blows, and the choking marks indicate that the perpetrator's hatred and anger towards Victoria Gabriel must have been particularly great. Now, this is consistent with what we said earlier about Victoria's storage chest is the only one that was searched. So she seems to be the focus of the murderer. The choking aspect seems particularly personal because,
right,
as we see from the other victims, you can kill your victim just with the mattock. You don't need to put your own hands on the victim, right? But here you have Victoria being choked, which is just not necessary when she has, 9 bludgeons to the head.
Yeah, and in the business, they call this overkill. I'm sure all of you who've, looked at any of these kind of murders or serial killers in particular have heard of that. And overkill usually just means that there is one victim who is murdered in a particularly gruesome or personal way, indicating that for whatever reason, the killer had a particular either personal hatred to them or, some serial killers kill a certain type. Ted Bundy famously killed women with very straight hair parted in the middle, who were a certain height and sort of a certain look, because his girlfriend that he had loved and he had proposed to, and this is, the story, I'm sure he would have killed people either way, but who he proposed to had rejected him, and that's what she looked like. So when he started picking targets, he picked targets who looked like her. And so all of his murders are overkill murders, and that's because he's sort of like fantasizing about murdering this woman over and over and over again. And in this case, you got everybody else is pretty much killed by one or two shots. I mean, this is sort of a calculated murder, right? So the two kids, it's one shot to the head. Andreas and Kazilia, the elder, one or two shots to the head. Same thing with the maid. But then you've got Victoria, who's not only struck several times, but is also choked. Going back to the fact that her room was also the only room that was ransacked, it makes you think whoever did this had some sort of personal connection to Victoria.
Right, and that goes against the passerby. How would you know this one woman? I guess she's the only young woman if someone is fixated on her. But again, you would have to watch the family for a while to know the individuals in this family. Again, we don't have the autopsies, but we do know that both children were killed by just a single crushing blow to the skull. And this is devastating, but it appears that little Kazilia likely survived for several hours before she ultimately expired. And this is an interesting note. Joseph was struck through the roof of his pram, indicating possibly that the killer could not look him in the face when he struck him. Now that's interesting because, remember, we don't quite know yet if Lorenz is the father of Joseph. And if there is a chance that Joseph is in fact his son, I can imagine it would be very difficult to look at him, even if there was a small chance that this was your son that you were about to kill. Or it may just be any individual. It would, I think, be difficult to kill a 2-year-old boy for seemingly no reason. But that particular fact does fit the narrative that Lorenz may be the murderer.
Okay, so those are some of the weird things that you see in this case. Some of the things that I think point you in a couple directions. And if you buy that it's someone close to the family, well, there's one suspect who is close to the family who is not Lorenz, and that's Carl Gabriel. This is actually a pretty popular one, that Carl Gabriel, who was supposedly killed in 1914, who was the husband of Victoria. It's possible that maybe he wasn't killed. I mean, remember, this is the fog of war. This is the front in 1914. At that point, it was a quickly moving front. It hadn't sort of bogged down into trench warfare, though even when it got to that point, there were so many people dying so quickly. There were certainly people who were thought to be dead who weren't dead. There were obviously people who were being captured. There are some people who think that Carl was captured by the Russians. There's talk of a German prisoner who was captured by the Russians but then became a Russian commissar, and maybe this person was Carl Gabriel and he's worked his way out of the camp and he made it back home, but it took him a while because he had to deal with all these issues. And he gets back, and what does he find? He finds his wife living with her father still in an incestuous relationship. He finds a bunch of kids who obviously aren't his because he wasn't around, for Joseph, for instance, to be born, and he sort of goes into a rage and murders his wife and murders his children. And there are things that commend this theory. Remember, you had Victoria acting so strangely in the days leading up to her death, and you have that story that's told after she dies that she supposedly had seen someone in a military-style coat in the forest, and they had sort of disappeared back into the forest when she looked at them. What if that was Carl? And what if she saw him? And what freaked her out is she's essentially seeing a ghost, right? She's seeing someone who's supposed to be dead, and here he is, returned from the dead to, haunt her for all the things she's done since he's gone missing. The problem with this story is there's a lot of eyewitness testimony about Carl's death. He was killed by a shell. This is according to several people who were there. He was killed by a shell that exploded nearby. That shell actually shattered his skull and killed him instantly. So, look, he didn't survive that. So if what they're telling is true, he's definitely dead. So you have to believe these eyewitnesses somehow got it wrong and that Carl really did survive and somehow has made it back. Now, my problem with this story is there's no reason to think, well, there are reasons to think, and the people in the town certainly thought that young Kazilia was her father's child, but Carl would have had every reason to think she was his. So even if he was going to go on this murderous rampage and kill everybody, you would think he would not kill her. So that's another reason to think it's not him, in addition to the fact that he probably did not survive the front.
Yeah, the Carl Gabriel theory, I think it's helpful to remember that there may be other suspects because we've talked about Lorenz so much, but I think it's probably unlikely because if you think about it, so many years had passed and let's say she thought he had died, he shows up. It's hard for him to be really angry if she moved on with her life and because she thought he was dead, right? Remember when Victoria was seen crying in the woods, she mentioned something about, I think, closing her accounts, right? And that doesn't really explain Carl, but it may explain her having to maybe pay someone off because of maybe someone else finding out or finding out that she's still having an affair with her father.
And she said something about how she needed to get away, you know? It's never been exactly clear what that meant. I have a theory about that, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, now there was another suspect that police investigated, and that's Joseph Flager. Now, this comes from a police report later on. This is not one of the initial police reports because they were looking for leads and they were offering a reward of 1,000 marks for any sort of information that could lead to the murderer in this case. And in response, Maria Flager, who was at the time about 20 years old, she was the daughter of the community pastor from Demhausen. She came to the Hohenwart police station and accused her own father, Joseph Flager, from Demhausen of the murder in Hinterkaifeck. When she was questioned, Maria described with astonishing accuracy the details of the murder that she learned from her father. Among other things, Maria stated that she had seen her father come into the kitchen of her parents' apartment after the murder. She believed this was around March 29th in the evening at about 11 p.m. And she would say that she remembered her father having bloody hands, blood splatters on his face and on his clothes. And Maria states that she asked her dad where the blood had come from, and he replied that he had just killed some people.
Very honest father.
Maria would have been around 6 years old at the time of the crime. While she described her father as easygoing, but he tended to be drunk. Because of what Maria said, Joseph Flager was arrested. Yeah, he was arrested in Augsburg, but he was released the following day because the suspicions that his daughter made were unfounded. Presumably, Maria was only concerned with receiving the reward of 1,000 marks that had been promised for solving the murder.
And let me just say, this is 1922 Germany. They got 6 murders on their hands. I kind of feel like if they could have pinned it on Joseph Flager, they would have, you know? So it must have really just fallen apart.
Yeah, they really just wanted to solve it. I mean, 1,000 marks is a lot to offer for a reward, and they acted quickly on it. What she even says from, I don't know what they ultimately decided after they arrested Flager, why they decided to let him go. But just her story seems a little unbelievable. She was 6 years old, but she was awake at 11 p.m., and her father walks in with blood all over himself, and 6-year-old Maria just says, "Father, where's the blood from?" And he responds icily, "I murdered some people." It just seems a little unbelievable. And the mother is supposedly there and she could corroborate that. And, if the father is a drunk, there's no indication that his wife would cover for him and not run to the police.
I bet Maria always did her chores after that.
Yeah.
Like, man, Dad, dang.
That's commitment to scaring your daughter.
Yeah. It is interesting that she knew details of the murder. I mean, I don't know what that means. The police report doesn't really tell us.
Kind of like how there are a lot of armchair detectives in the true crime community who end up knowing so much about a case because of reading about it, because of talking to people about it. Maybe she was just fascinated with this case and learned everything she could about this case from public sources, but also from speaking with people who were in the area and knew kind of what the rumor was around town.
And remember, Lorenz paraded everybody and their brother through the murder scene that night. So it's possible a lot of people knew details about the crime.
That's right. There were tours of the house.
Right. I don't know how much that says. And that's the problem. And this goes back to something we talk about a lot. It's the reason the police keep a lot of stuff close to the vest, because they know people are going to show up. They're going to claim to have done the crime. They're going to claim to know who did the crime. And when you have a bunch of information that nobody knows except the police, you can use that to sort of exclude them. And you wonder if maybe the police just didn't have that much information in this one because of Lorenz's, death house tours that he ran. So another couple suspects that the police considered were the Bickler brothers. And I kind of love this because basically the Bickler brothers were just the guys that nobody liked in town. They were kind of the rough and tumble dudes who, were probably always beating up people at the pub or whatnot, or the beer house, I guess, in Germany. But from the police report, quote, "From all that has been described so far and from the information provided by the persons questioned on the matter, it is undoubtedly evident that the two Bickler people are capable of any act. They are also widely feared in the area, which has resulted in most cases not being reported." So this is the fairly typical something horrible happens, and everybody's like, well, where's the Bickler brothers? Round up the usual suspects. They probably did it. The problem is, for this, the police really looked into these guys. I'm sure the police would have loved to hang these murders on the Bickler brothers. But other than the fact they appear to just be like worthless thugs, there's no evidence that actually ties them to the crime.
That makes me think, I wonder if, because the Bickler brothers are so well known in this area, if Lorenz, if he did make up the fact that there were two footprints, had that in mind, that there were kind of this pair of unsavory brothers that people in town didn't like and who could be capable of something like this. You could send the police on a wild goose chase in that direction.
That's a great question, and I wonder how old the Bickler brothers were at the time, if they were between 18 and 22. Yep, that's a great point. Great point.
Now, there are two other suspects, Carl and Andreas Saddleberg. This is many, many, many decades later. In 1971, a woman known as Therese T. claimed that when she was 12 years old, her mother had a visit from the mother of the two murderers from Hinterkaifeck. During the conversation, the names of the two men who are said to have committed the crime were mentioned, and those people were the brothers Carl and Andreas S. from Saddleberg. The woman made a rather confused impression to the police, but she had her mother's notes about this encounter, which included the following sentence: "Andreas regretted losing his pocket knife." The detective inspector was surprised that this woman mentioned a pocket knife, as few people knew one had been found at the scene. The origin of the pocket knife was never clarified. It could have belonged to the old Gruber as well as to the murderer. So again, this is decades later, and the only thing that really makes it interesting is the mention of this pocket knife.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, this is an interesting one, right? Because there was a pocket knife found when they tore down the house. It was found in the barn. And hey, I mean, in some ways that's a weak connection, but you do wonder. I mean, this is another sort of weird story, right? Like, what'd they do? They went home and they're like, "Hey, Mom, how's it going?" "Yeah, we just killed 6 people. Yeah, I dropped my pocket knife. Really sucks." It's really the worst part of this is that I lost my pocket knife. Like, it's really kind of unclear why they would tell their mother this, and then why the mother would tell somebody else's mother this. I mean, it's a very strange sort of thing. I've never seen any evidence beyond the loss of the pocket knife thing. This is from 1971, so it's not like they could really follow up on this story. I have no idea why Therese waited so long to tell this story. It's just sort of an interesting, inexplicable thing. I have no idea why Carl and Andreas would do this, but that's basically kind of all we know about these two is that. And once again, this is an international podcast. We have a few fans out in Germany. So if you know more about these two, we would be fascinated to talk more about them in a follow-up, because it is interesting. Once again, if you have information that only the killer should know, it's nice to be able to put it out there. The pocket knife does seem to be one of those things that there just weren't a lot of people who knew about the pocket knife. So it's possible this is legit, but we just don't have a whole lot to go on.
Right. And I wonder if, many people had pocket knives and maybe and she was only 12 years old hearing this story. Maybe she misheard something and her mom was mentioning a pocket knife. But I would imagine, especially if you were a working person on farms, you probably always had a pocket knife on you.
Right. Like everybody had a pocket knife.
Right.
Right. Okay. The next potential suspect, Paul Mueller, also known as the Man from the Train. So there's this great book called The Man from the Train, The Solving of a Century-Old Serial Killer Mystery by Bill James and his daughter, Rachel McCarthy James. And the book, it's really interesting because it goes through a series of murders committed in the early 1900s using an axe in the United States. And it ties all these seemingly unrelated murders together by the fact they were close to train tracks. And the theory that Bill James puts forward is that you had a person who was essentially a hobo who's riding the rails, and they would just jump off of a train, go to a house near the train tracks, murder the people in the house, and then get back on the train and ride away. And no one would ever know it was them. They typically used the axe that was the family's axe. So basically they'd show up, they'd find the wood pile, they'd pick up the axe. They followed the Brett method of axe murdering. They would use the not sharp side of the axe so as not to, stick that axe in any skulls. You don't want that to happen. And they did all this, and this person, James, the Jameses, speculate is the person who is responsible for one of the most famous axe murders in the United States, the Villisca axe murders, and makes a really compelling argument that this person is responsible for that murder in addition to several others. And they traced this sort of string of murders back to what they think is the first murder. And that murder, they know, was committed by a man named Paul Mueller. Paul Mueller was from Germany. I think he was actually from Austria, but, same difference. Came to the United States, worked as a laborer, sort of traveling around, the exact type person you would think would do this, committed a murder very similar to all these other murders, and then disappeared. Their theory is he committed all these murders and then at some point decided to go back home. So he goes back to Germany, he goes back to Austria, and then essentially picks up his trade there and is traveling around committing these crimes. There are a few other murders that happened in the area around the time that are sort of similar to this. In Ebersberg in 1920, which is around 50 miles southeast of Hinterkaifeck, a farmer in his 60s and his wife were both bludgeoned to death in their beds with an axe. They had the blankets pulled over them, which is something that the Man from the Train also did. It's also something that happened at Villisca. Money was left in clear view, which is something that happened in all the Man for the Train murders and happened in Villisca and happened in Hinterkaifeck. So robbery was not the motive. There was another similar crime in Untern Arnbach, which is less than 5 miles and a few days after Hinterkaifeck, so 5 miles away and a few days later, and it bore striking similarities, including the bludgeoning of the farmer, but the wife did get away in this case. So James sort of throws out at the end that, maybe Paul Mueller was responsible for Hinterkaifeck as well. And like I said, the argument said he hung around the place for a while, which is something that Paul Mueller did. He didn't steal anything, which is something that Paul Mueller did. He tended to have overkill on at least one victim, which we have here. The distinction, though, is it's pretty clear that Paul Mueller was a pedophile, and so usually he would sexually assault / overkill one of the young girls in the family. We don't have that here. Whoever killed the young Kazilia didn't even make sure she was dead, right? They struck her once and moved on. That's not really consistent with Paul Mueller. And the fact of the matter is, we don't actually have any reason to think Mueller was there other than sort of the speculation by James. The reason these killings stopped in the United States was because he had left the country. It's just as likely that he was dead or he was arrested or something along those lines. So it's an interesting theory. I like the theory. It's kind of romantic, in a bloody, terrible way to think that Mueller did this. But I don't know, other than just being interesting, I don't know that we can tie it to Mueller.
Yeah, it's a really interesting outside of the box theory, but for all the reasons we explained earlier, it's hard to think that this murderer didn't know the family well.
Right. I think that's right. I think the evidence points to the fact this was not a stranger.
And so that leads us to the suspect that we've discussed repeatedly the last couple of days, and that is Lorenz Schlittenbauer. According to the police report, and this is quoted from it, Lorenz Schlittenbauer showed a somewhat excited demeanor when he came with us to the scene of the murder. He talked a lot and made himself important in other ways, took care of everything, and was also familiar with the domestic circumstances of the murdered. He knew best. He also offered to take into custody 2 sick young pigs who had apparently suffered badly from hunger and thirst. With the consent of Mayor Grieger, he put these pigs in his home. The excitement of the sledge-maker, remember that's what they called Lorenz in the early days, can perhaps be explained by the fact that among those murdered was his own child, the 2.5-year-old Joseph Gruber. When he was still widowed, Schlittenbauer and Victoria Gabriel, whose husband fell in the field in 1915 or 16, maintained a relationship that was not without consequences. Schlittenbauer would have married Victoria Gabriel too, but the father, Andreas Gruber, did not agree with this marriage. He paid all of the child's alimony in advance and then married another woman, and he being Lorenz here. Lorenz did pay the child's alimony, but married someone else. He is considered to be well off. Later, Lorenz was still friendly with the Gruber family, so he was not enemies with them. Schlittenbauer has no motive for such a horrific act.
And of course, this was the police report that basically was right when this happened. These officers show up, and Lorenz is super helpful, and he knows everything. And interestingly, he knows all about taking care of the animals. In particular, he knows that these 2 pigs are sick, and he wants to take care of those pigs or whatnot. But the police, after talking to him, are like, hey, doesn't have any motive, no reason to think he would do this. He's not enemies with the family. They sort of seem to rule him out, at least initially.
Which, by the way, just reading that excerpt of the police report, the last sentence, the conclusion that he has no motive to act, seems to come out of nowhere. Like, it doesn't seem particularly supported by the previous observations, right? That he did, in fact, he was planning on marrying Victoria, but he ended up not marrying her. That, of course, they don't think that he killed his child, but there's so much familiarity with the family. There's so much intertwining with the family, both with the animals, with the daughter, Victoria, with the child, Joseph, that it doesn't lead to the conclusion automatically without anything else that he has no motive to act. The police revisit this because in a 1931 report, they seem to pose a different possibility. Now, if you can read German, maybe translate this better for us. We have a translation from Google Translate, but I think the general idea of the report is that the Grubers were known to be a greedy family. And remember, they had asked for child alimony for Joseph. And at the time, Lorenz did pay that alimony, but it can be assumed, the police thought, that Schlittenbauer actually was asked for more money by the Grubers, and maybe something happened right before these murders that his anger about the situation was rekindled. Because remember, he may have gotten Victoria pregnant, and he would have married her, he proposed, but he ended up not marrying her. And so the police in this report says it seems explainable to me that possibly the murder could have been triggered by some sort of discussion between Lorenz and Victoria Gabriel, especially since the autopsy reports indicate that Victoria was the first to be killed. That was a little bit confusing. Basically, money may have been at issue because the Grubers, I think, may have tried to swindle him out of more money, maybe tried to blackmail him, something like that, and it may have made him angry, which is why he committed this murder.
Yeah, there's this speculation that, Gruber's kind of a jerk, right? And so Lorenz gets Gruber put in jail. Just think back all the way to when this baby issue was happening. He gets Gruber put in jail. He's accusing him of incest. There's no reason for him to back off of that, but he does. And in fact, not only does he back off of it, but he supports that by paying money to the Grubers for the child. Now, it seems like they paid it back to him, and you have to wonder, what in the world was going on here? And I'm convinced that Victoria went to him and sort of pleaded with him based on the love that he had for her to take care of this so that her father didn't go to jail and that her child wasn't labeled as the product of incest for the rest of his life. And he agreed to do that. And so publicly, he took charge of this child to the extent that in the police reports, they are saying he's the father of the child, right? And it seems like in 1931, the police have this idea that maybe Andreas, being the greedy bastard that he is, went back to Lorenz and was like, hey, we need more money for the child. We got to take care of the child. And Lorenz might have been like, what are you talking about? It's not mine. And Andreas might have said, well, in the eyes of everybody else, it is. In the eyes of everybody else, you've said this is your kid. So unless you want us to take you to court or whatnot, you need to pay us more money, right? Like you can imagine something like that happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the police report goes on to say that he can't substantiate every detail of what we just told you with unequivocal statements, but he can imagine that something had to set off the killer so much to be so violent to even a small child, the 2.5-year-old Joseph. So the impression this officer gets is that the murder was more of an act of revenge rather than a robbery. We think the evidence points to that too. There were so many things of value that were left behind, jewelry, money that was just not taken. And so it does seem to be motivated by emotion, maybe some sort of vendetta, revenge, rather than personal gain in money. So this police report goes on to say that the police officer finds out later on that Lorenz, at some time later, had mentioned a well-known biblical verse saying that when the question of murder comes up, that they were guilty of incest and subject to the wrath of God. And Lorenz is purported to say, quote, it was a divine judgment. God just chose one of his own and who did it, and he was the only instrument of God's punitive justice.
Yeah, you got to wonder whether Lorenz actually said that or not. It's not clear from the report exactly how this came up, but it does seem like maybe Lorenz said this to multiple people, and there were sort of multiple witnesses who at various times heard Lorenz refer to the murders as divine justice for the incest of the family. Now, look, there are probably a lot of people in the area who thought that. There were plenty of people who thought Andreas Gruber was the worst of the worst, and I'm sure there were a lot of grandmas sitting around the sewing circle or whatever saying that exact same thing. But when you hear it from somebody who might be a suspect, it seems like it's a little bit more significant.
And it's just hard to glean a lot from this statement because maybe Lorenz was happy they were murdered, even if he doesn't, not happy that they were murdered, but he had a lot of beef with this family, a lot of history tied up with it. They were his neighbors. He had to deal with this every single day. He couldn't just put this behind him and leave it be. And maybe he did think this was divine judgment, even though it wasn't him. But I agree with you. If you know that you've been interviewed by the police multiple times and is a suspect, and I don't think I'd go around saying that. So what do you think happened, Brett?
What do I think happened? I feel like we've probably telegraphed it pretty strongly what we think happened, or what I think happened. I assume we're on the same page here. I think if you look at the evidence, it seems pretty clear that whoever did this knew the family. I just don't think there's any question about that. I don't believe this was some random person. If it was a random person, they would have stolen the money. Obviously, there are people like Paul Mueller who killed people not for money. There are, psychosexual killers who kill for sexual gratification, but we don't see any evidence of that here. Now, look, this is 1922, and the police censored themselves in reports. So if there was evidence of some sort of sexual activity, especially post-mortem, it's possible the police wouldn't even have mentioned that. And that's unfortunate for those of us who are trying to reconstruct it, but there's certainly there's no evidence we see of it, which makes you think you're going to kill 6 people. This is probably somebody who knew the family. It's somebody who knew the habits of the family. We've talked about Lorenz. He knew these people. He knew their domestic situation. He knew the fact that they didn't have a gun. He could have suspected how they would react to certain things. I think what was going on in the attic, why did that happen? I think that happened because whoever did it planned on murdering them in the attic. I think the thought of the person who killed them was, they're going to come up into this attic and I'm going to kill them up here. And it didn't work out that day because they didn't go up there. And so they had to make a new plan. So they do the barn plan where they're killing people in the barn, maybe because of the cow that got loose or whatnot. But there's something about Lorenz that I feel like gets lost in all these discussions. Because here's the thing. The question people always ask is, why now? You know, you have the police who are trying to say, well, maybe they asked him for some more money. Maybe that's what it was. Maybe that's what set him off. Maybe that's why all of a sudden, after 3 years, we go from being friendly to murdering a bunch of people. But there was something that happened right around this that I have to wonder if it's what triggered him. Remember, when Andreas and Lorenz met at the fence line or whatever at their farms, the day after, people are wandering around in his attic or whatnot. What does Lorenz tell him? Lorenz tells him that his first child with his new wife has died from illness, right? Lorenz has just suffered this huge loss. And there's a couple things that could be going through a grief-stricken Lorenz's mind in that moment. Number one, why did this happen to me? Why is God punishing me? Number two, and why is it that Andreas Gruber still has his son? Why is it that with everything he's done and all the sins he's committed and all the terrible things that have happened, his son's still alive? Joseph's still alive. And if he hadn't stood in the way, I could have married Victoria, who I loved, and I wouldn't be going through this. And that's what I think triggered it. I think when his son died, he thought, this is not right. I'm going to make this right. God is punishing me for letting this happen. And I think he went to that farmhouse and he killed all those people. And I think the reason he was so violent with Victoria was because at the end of the day, while Andreas might have been the person, the sinner, as it were, Victoria was the one who was supposed to love him. And Victoria was the one that he loved, and she let this happen to him, and she wouldn't make it better. And I can even imagine that maybe they had some discussions up to that point. Maybe he was the one Victoria was talking to in the forest when she was breaking down into tears. Maybe they had continued their relationship. It's hard to say. But to me, the person who has the motive, the means, the opportunity is Lorenz. He is by far the best suspect in this case.
That's pretty compelling. I had forgotten what he said, what Lorenz had said and what he was going through personally at the time. I remember when we talked about how he had just lost his firstborn child with his new wife, was how strange for him then to be away so often in the following days when people keep dropping by to let him know that something weird is going on at the Gruber's house. I remember thinking, if your child had just passed away, you would think you'd be around with grieving with your family or helping your, wife heal or something like that. So that's a really good theory, Brett.
And people try and explain sort of Lorenz's weird behavior at the house that, he's pulling the bodies and moving the bodies around because he's worried about his son. He wants to know, is my son alive or dead? But if you believe that, why didn't he check on his son 3 days before? Why wasn't the first thing he did when he sent his kids over there? Why didn't he go over there if he's worried about his son? When he walks over there with his neighbors, he's saying, they're probably all dead, right? He's saying they probably all, they've all hung themselves or whatever. And his whole statement about how nothing moves here, there's death in this place. I mean, there's a lot of weirdness going on with Lorenz at the time. And to me, I think it just all fits with the fact that he's the person who did this.
All right, Brett, 100-year-old mystery. I think you just solved it.
There you go. And look, it is a 100-year-old mystery. A lot of people spend a lot of time with this. So I have no doubt that there are many folks out there who do not agree with our hypothesis, that do not think that Lorenz is guilty. If that's the case, I would love for you guys to reach out to us and let us know. You know how to get in touch with us, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We're also on YouTube. We're on Reddit. If you want to support the show, we have a Patreon page. We're just all over the place. So feel free to reach out to us. Let us know what you think. Let us know if you have any alternative theories. We're going to put some links on the website. We'll also link to that book, The Man from the Train. A little long, but worth a read. Very interesting, particularly if you're interested in the Villisca Axe murders. Very interesting book. Also, if you're looking for other podcasts on this, I've mentioned this podcast a couple times. Cold Case Murder Mysteries does an episode on this. I won't give it away, but I think some of his thoughts are similar to our thoughts. But obviously, there's a lot of people who've talked about this case. It's a really interesting case, really famous case for all the reasons we have discussed. And Alice, I have enjoyed going through this one with you.
Another wonderful historical mystery.
I do love the historical mysteries. Somebody said that I need to let you talk more, as if I could stop you from talking.
Thank you for whoever's fighting my fight. I appreciate you wanting me to talk more. I'll try to talk more next time. But Brett's just so good at doing everything, because we have many more emails that ask Brett to just read, the phone book to them so they can bask in your wonderful voice.
We need some praise for Alice out there, guys. She's developing, some low self-esteem on the podcast.
That is not true.
Everybody let Alice know how awesome she is, because she is awesome. I tell her this at the beginning of every podcast. You'd think she'd know it by now. Well, we have 1 week to go in October. Halloween is right around the corner. Hope everybody's got their costumes. And we have one more spooky story for you. But that will be next week. And until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Did you see that weird review we got where they were like, they reference cases they've talked about before too much? It was like a 2-star review.
Yeah, I hate this.
It was very strange.
And no, it wasn't referencing cases. It's literally the phrase, as we mentioned, as we've talked about previously, which is just true. Because we've talked about 404B.
Yeah, I mean, we're tying things together.
Well, but it's also like when you're reading a book and they previously talked about 404B, we're not going to rehash what FOIA is.
That was clearly somebody who's not a fan, and I don't care what they think, is my opinion.
Yeah.
They were listening to like one episode for some reason, and then were like, well, I don't like the fact they talk about things they've done before. Whatever.
Don't get mad. Get glad.